From arguably the most famous, volatile, and culturally impactful maximum security prison in Massachusetts, history, to a prison that houses a highly secretive and heavily restrictive solitary confinement block. Today we dive inside the top 10 most dangerous prisons in Massachusetts and take a look at their dangerous residents. Case 1. Kristen Gilbert. Date of the crimes: 1995 to 1996. Location: Northampton, Massachusetts, Veterans Affairs Medical Center. Jurisdiction: prosecuted in the United States District Court for the District of Massachusetts, with trial held in Springfield. There is a particular kind of trust that people place in a hospital room. It is not the same as trusting a stranger on the street or even trusting a friend. It is total, and it is usually unconscious. You do not check the credentials of the nurse standing over your bed at 2 in the morning. You do not ask her to prove that the syringe in her hand contains what she says it contains. You simply believe, because the alternative is unthinkable, that the person caring for you wants you to live. For a group of aging military veterans being treated at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Northampton, Massachusetts in the mid-1990s, that unconscious trust was, for some of them, the last mistake they ever made. Kristen Gilbert did not look like anyone's idea of a threat. She was young, sharp, and by every outward account, extremely good at her job. Co-workers describe a nurse who moved efficiently through chaos, who kept her composure when alarms were sounding and other staff were scrambling. In the emotionally exhausting environment of a ward that treated critically ill and elderly veterans, a nurse like that was valuable. Doctors leaned on her judgment. Colleagues respected her instincts. And crucially, nobody was looking at her as the source of the chaos she so calmly managed. What investigators would eventually piece together, months and then years later, was a pattern almost too disturbing to accept at first glance. Gilbert had access to epinephrine, a naturally occurring hormone used medically to jolt a failing heart back into rhythm, and one of the most dangerous substances imaginable when administered to a patient who does not need it. In careful, controlled doses, in the right clinical context, it saves lives. Injected without cause into a stable patient, it can trigger a sudden and violent cardiac event. The heart races uncontrollably, blood pressure spikes, and the body goes into crisis in a matter of moments. Prosecutors would later argue that Gilbert used this drug not to heal, but to manufacture emergencies, and then to be the one who responded to them. When a patient's heart stopped, hospital protocol called for a code blue, an all-hands emergency response that pulled staff from across the floor into a single room, fighting to bring someone back. In many of these codes, according to testimony at her later trial, Gilbert was already there, already leading the response, already the calm center of a storm that, investigators alleged, she herself had started. If the patient survived, she was the nurse who had saved a life under impossible pressure. If the patient did not survive, she was the nurse who had done everything right and simply lost the fight, one loss among many, absorbed into the ordinary sadness of a hospital that treated very sick, very old men. Either outcome protected her. Either outcome kept anyone from looking too closely. For a disturbingly long time, nobody did. What eventually broke the pattern open wasn't a single dramatic discovery. It was accumulation. Nurses on the ward began to notice something that felt less like coincidence and more like a schedule. Cardiac emergencies clustered, again and again around Gilbert's shifts. At the same time, the hospital's epinephrine supply, a drug that should have been used predictably and sparingly, was disappearing faster than it could be explained by ordinary patient care. Two threads, both quiet on their own, began to feel impossible to ignore when pulled together. In February of 1996, 3 of Gilbert's fellow nurses made the decision that would ultimately end her career and her freedom. They went to hospital administrators with what they'd observed. It was not an easy thing to do, accusing a well-liked, competent colleague of something almost unspeakable, based on a pattern that was, at that point, still circumstantial. But they went anyway, and their report set a federal investigation into motion. Gilbert, according to investigators, sensed the walls closing in before charges were ever filed. She admitted herself to a psychiatric facility, and in an act that would later be presented to jurors as further evidence of her state of mind, she phoned in a bomb threat to the very medical center where the investigation into her was unfolding. A chaotic, dangerous act that disrupted hospital operations and pulled focus, however briefly, away from the mounting case against her. Because the alleged killings took place on federal property, a VA hospital falls under federal jurisdiction. Gilbert was not tried in a Massachusetts state courtroom. Her case belonged to the United States government, and federal prosecutors spent years building it, piece by piece. Staffing logs that placed her at the bedside of patient after patient in the moments before their hearts failed, epinephrine inventory records that didn't add up, and the testimony of colleagues who had once trusted her without question and now had to explain, under oath, exactly why they no longer did. The trial began in late 2000, unfolding in federal court in Springfield, Massachusetts, and stretching into the following year. Jurors heard from grieving families of the veterans who had died. They heard from medical experts who walked through, case by case, why the deaths that had once looked like unfortunate but explainable complications now looked, in hindsight, like something else entirely. They heard about a nurse who prosecutors argued had turned a place built to protect the most vulnerable among us into something far darker, and who had done so in part to feel needed, admired, and important in the eyes of the people around her. In March of 2001, the jury returned its verdict: guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder, guilty on 1 count of second-degree murder, and guilty on 2 counts of attempted murder. It was one of the most significant convictions of a healthcare serial killer in the United States at that time, confirming publicly what had, for years, existed only as suspicion and grief inside the walls of a single VA hospital. Federal prosecutors pursued the death penalty. It was a real possibility. Gilbert's crimes had been committed against some of the country's most vulnerable citizens, men who had served their country and come to a hospital trusting they would be cared for, not harmed. But the jury, after weighing the case for her life, chose otherwise. Kristen Gilbert was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, a sentence that guarantees she will never again set foot outside a federal prison. She remains incarcerated today at the Federal Medical Center in Carswell, Texas, a facility built to house female inmates with significant medical and psychiatric needs. There is a bitter irony in that placement: a woman convicted of turning a hospital into a hunting ground, now spending the rest of her life inside an institution built entirely around medical care. In the years since her conviction, the Gilbert case has been cited repeatedly in discussions about hospital safety, about how medication access is tracked, how unusual patterns in patient outcomes are flagged, and how institutions can better protect the people in their care from threats that come not from outside the building, but from within it. It is a legacy built entirely out of tragedy, a set of veterans who trusted the system meant to protect them, and a system that for too long failed to see what was happening in plain sight. If you're finding value in these cases, take a moment to hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and drop a comment letting us know which case affected you most. We read every one. Case 2. Karen Reed. Date of the incident: January 29, 2022. Location: Canton, Massachusetts. Jurisdiction: Norfolk Superior Court, Norfolk County, with retrial in 2025. Some cases end quietly, with a verdict that closes the book for almost everyone involved. Others refuse to close at all, and instead grow louder with every year that passes, pulling in strangers who have never met anyone connected to the case, until an entire state feels like it has a personal stake in the outcome. The case of Karen Reed became the second kind almost immediately, and it has not stopped growing since. John O'Keefe was, by every account offered by the people who loved him, the kind of man a family could build itself around. A 16-year veteran of the Boston Police Department, he had taken on the responsibility of helping to raise his late sister's 2 children after she passed away, stepping into a role no one asks for and few people handle with the steadiness he was remembered for. He was a fixture in his community, a familiar face to fellow officers, and by January of 2022, he was in a relationship, often described as increasingly strained, with Karen Reed, an adjunct college professor and financial analyst. On the night of January 28th, the two went out with friends, moving between bars in the Canton, Massachusetts area. As the night wore on, the group's plans shifted toward an after-party at a home on Fairview Road, the residence of another Boston police officer. According to the timeline prosecutors would later present, Reed drove O'Keefe there in her black Lexus SUV, arriving in the earliest hours of January 29th. What happened in the hours that followed has never been agreed upon by a single party in this case. Not the prosecution, not the defense, and increasingly not the public that has spent years dissecting every detail of it online. The Commonwealth's version of events was direct, that an argument broke out between Reed and O'Keefe, that it escalated, and that Reed, in a moment of rage, backed her SUV into O'Keefe, striking him with enough force to cause severe injury, and then left him outside alone as a brutal winter storm bore down on the area. Hours later, in the freezing early morning, Reed and two acquaintances went looking for O'Keefe and found his body in the snow on the front lawn of the Fairview Road home. He had suffered serious head trauma and had been exposed to dangerously cold conditions for an extended period. He was rushed to a nearby hospital where he was pronounced dead. Investigators built their case around physical evidence recovered in the days that followed: a shattered tail light on Reed's Lexus and fragments of red plastic found near the spot where O'Keefe's body had been discovered. Fragments that, prosecutors argued, matched the housing of her vehicle's broken light almost precisely. They also pointed to voicemails Reed had left on O'Keefe's phone in the hours before his death, messages that, when played for jurors, were framed as evidence of a relationship that had curdled into anger that night. Reed was indicted on charges that included second-degree murder, manslaughter, while operating under the influence of alcohol, and leaving the scene of personal injury and death. From the very beginning, she pleaded not guilty to all of it, and her defense team did not simply argue reasonable doubt. They built an entirely different narrative of that night, one built around allegation of institutional failure and, in their telling, deliberate misconduct. According to the defense, O'Keefe never made contact with Reed's vehicle at all. Instead, they argued, he had gone inside the Fairview Road home, become involved in a violent altercation with people present, including, they claimed, being attacked by a dog inside the house, and had ultimately been left outside afterward, unconscious or dying, by people with far more direct knowledge of what happened to him than Reed herself. More explosively, the defense alleged that members of law enforcement investigating the case had personal and professional ties to the homeowner and his family, and that evidence, including the tail light fragments central to the prosecution's case, had been mishandled or, in the defense's telling, planted. It was an allegation serious enough and specific enough that it triggered scrutiny well beyond the courtroom, feeding a public fascination that turned the case into something closer to a national phenomenon than a local homicide trial. The first trial opened in the spring of 2024 in Norfolk Superior Court in Dedham, Massachusetts, and stretched across weeks of often contradictory forensic testimony, competing timelines, and pointed cross-examinations of the very investigators who had built the case. Outside the courthouse, the scene rarely resembled a typical criminal trial. Supporters of Reed gathered daily, some holding signs, some live streaming proceedings to online audiences who had, by that point, developed strong opinions about a case they were following from thousands of miles away. Amateur investigators picked apart crime scene photographs frame by frame. Podcasts were built entirely around the case. A local blogger covering the trial and confronting witnesses directly was himself arrested on charges of witness intimidation, a development that only added another layer to an already extraordinary story. After days of deliberation, the jury told the court they could not reach a unanimous verdict. In July of 2024, the judge declared a mistrial, an outcome that satisfied no one and that guaranteed the case, rather than concluding would simply continue. Months of additional pre-trial hearings followed before a second trial began in April of 2025, again in Norfolk Superior Court. The evidence presented was, in broad strokes, familiar: the tail light, the voicemails, the competing timelines of that January night, but this time argued before a new jury, with years of additional public scrutiny hanging over every witness who took the stand. In June of 2025, after 4 days of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Karen Reed was found not guilty of second-degree murder, not guilty of manslaughter. She was convicted on a single, far lesser charge: operating under the influence of alcohol. Outside the courthouse, supporters who had spent years defending her innocence celebrated openly. For John O'Keefe's family, the outcome meant something entirely different: a legal conclusion that closed the criminal case against Reed without ever producing an agreed-upon answer to the question that started it all. What actually happened to John O'Keefe on that snow-covered lawn? To date, no one else has been charged in his death. The Reed case leaves behind more questions than resolutions about how a single winter night can fracture a community's trust in its own police department, about how a courtroom battle can become a cultural spectacle, and about how a family can be left, even after a verdict, still searching for the truth of how they lost someone they loved. Before we move to the next case, if this channel has been earning your trust, earn it back by hitting subscribe and leaving a comment with your take on this one. We'll be back with Case 3 when you're ready. Case 3. Judy Church, November 11th, 2022. Essex Superior Court. There's a particular kind of poison that has nothing to do with chemistry. It builds in silence, behind closed doors, in a relationship nobody around it ever fully understood. And in the quiet town of Salisbury, Massachusetts, a woman spent years absorbing that particular kind of poison, until she decided to turn it into something literal. This is the story of Judy Church. To understand what happened on a November night in 2022, you first have to understand the years that came before it, because this was not a case that erupted out of nowhere. It was a case that had been quietly assembling itself for a very long time, piece by piece, wound by wound, inside a relationship that never followed any conventional shape. Judy Church was 67 years old, a woman who had spent a significant portion of her adult life entangled with 55-year-old Leroy Fowler. Theirs was not a simple partnership. It was, by every account those close to them would later give, an open and complicated arrangement, one where Fowler maintained a separate, parallel relationship with another woman, Barbara Randall, an arrangement that was not some secret Church stumbled upon by accident. It was common knowledge. Everyone around them knew. Church herself knew, every single day for years. Living inside that kind of arrangement takes a particular kind of endurance, the ability to wake up each morning and choose again, to stay inside a situation that keeps reopening the same wound. For a while, by whatever internal calculus governs relationships like this one, Church seemed to manage it. She stayed. She continued the relationship. On the surface, at least, life carried on. But underneath that surface, something else was happening. Something that would only come to light after investigators began combing through her home in the aftermath of what happened. They found, tucked away in a private corner of her life, a doll fashioned in the likeness of Barbara Randall. Not a toy, not a keepsake, a vessel for something much darker, an object Church would take out in moments of private rage, sticking it with pins, throwing it, venting years of buried resentment onto a stand-in for the woman she blamed for her own unhappiness. It is tempting in hindsight to see that doll as nothing more than a strange, almost pitiable coping mechanism, a private ritual that let off just enough steam to keep the relationship functioning on the surface. But prosecutors would later argue something far colder, that this ritual wasn't a release valve at all. It was a rehearsal, a years-long build-up toward an act of violence that had in Church's mind already been decided long before it happened. The date prosecutors say she finally chose to act tells its own story. November 11th, 2022 was Leroy Fowler's birthday. There is something almost unbearable about that detail, a day meant for celebration, chosen instead as the day everything would end. Church prepared a drink for Fowler that day, a fruit punch-flavored Powerade, the kind of ordinary, unremarkable beverage that raises no suspicion at all. Into that drink, prosecutors say, she introduced ethylene glycol, an industrial chemical most commonly associated with antifreeze and hydraulic brake fluid. It carries a property that makes it uniquely dangerous in exactly this kind of scenario. A deceptively sweet taste, easily masked inside something sugary. It is, in the wrong hands, an almost perfect weapon, one that gives no warning to the person drinking it. Fowler had no reason to suspect anything. He drank it on his own birthday, unaware that the woman he had shared so much of his life with had just set something irreversible into motion. What followed was not quick. Ethylene glycol poisoning is a slow, brutal process, one that moves methodically through the body, attacking the kidneys, flooding the system with a level of pain that becomes harder and harder to hide as the hours pass. As that process began to take hold of Leroy Fowler, as his body began the long process of failing, Judy Church did something that would come to define this entire case in the minds of the jury who would eventually hear it. She did not call for help. Instead, prosecutors say she picked up her phone and began recording him, capturing his suffering as it unfolded in front of her, at one point reportedly asking him, with a kind of chilling detachment that is difficult to fully process, whether he was having fun. More than 30 minutes passed before she finally placed the call to emergency services. 30 minutes that, in a case like this, can be the entire difference between survival and something far worse. By the time paramedics reached him, Fowler's body was already shutting down under the weight of what had been done to it. He was rushed for emergency treatment, and for 2 days, doctors worked to understand and reverse what was happening inside him. It wasn't enough. Fowler was ultimately declared brain dead, and his family was left to make a decision no family should ever have to make, the decision to let him go. An autopsy would later confirm what investigators had already begun to piece together. Leroy Fowler's death was the direct result of poisoning. Church was arrested weeks later, on December 22, 2022. And as her case made its way toward trial in early 2026, her defense team attempted to construct an entirely different version of events, one built around the idea of a tragic accident rather than a deliberate act. They argued that Fowler had overdosed accidentally on a prescription narcotic, and they painted a picture of a couple who had in fact been happily planning a joint move to Florida, a portrait of quiet domestic contentment rather than simmering resentment. That narrative did not survive contact with the evidence. When the jury was shown the video Church herself had recorded, the footage of Fowler's suffering, captured instead of stopped, paired with a digital search history that told an entirely different story about where her mind had been in the days leading up to his death, the alternate narrative her defense had built collapsed almost immediately. On March 30th, 2026, a jury sitting in Essex Superior Court convicted Judy Church of first-degree murder under the combined theories of deliberate premeditation and extreme atrocity or cruelty. It was a verdict that left little room for ambiguity about how the jury viewed both the planning behind what happened and the callousness of choosing to film a dying man rather than save him. On April 2nd, 2026, Church received the only sentence available under Massachusetts law for that conviction: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. She was transported to the Massachusetts Correctional Institution at Framingham, where she will spend the remainder of her life. A woman who let years of quiet, festering resentment calcify into an act of violence on the one day of the year meant to celebrate the person she ultimately destroyed. If anything about this case resonates with your own experience inside a difficult or unhealthy relationship, please know that support is available. The National Domestic Violence Hotline can be reached at any hour, and speaking with someone doesn't have to wait until things reach a breaking point. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 4. Carolyn Riley, December 13th, 2006, Suffolk Superior Court. Not every act of violence looks like violence while it's happening. Some of the most disturbing cases in Massachusetts history didn't involve a knife, a struggle, or a single dramatic moment at all. They unfolded slowly, quietly, hidden behind something that looked, on paper, entirely legitimate: a prescription pad, a diagnosis, a doctor's signature. This is the story of Rebecca Riley, 4 years old, and the mother whose choices ended her life. To understand this case, you have to start with a household that, from the outside, looked like it was simply managing more than most families ever have to. Carolyn Riley and her husband, Michael, were raising 3 young children in Hull, Massachusetts. All 3 of those children had been diagnosed, at ages that would strike most people as almost impossibly young, with both attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and bipolar disorder. Those diagnoses came from a single local psychiatrist, a woman whose approach to treating the Riley children involved an aggressive combination of psychiatric medications. Among those medications was clonidine, a powerful blood pressure drug that had no formal approval for treating attention or behavioral issues in children, but which was, at the time, being prescribed off-label in an effort to manage hyperactivity and sleep disruption in young patients. It's the kind of detail that, on its own, might simply read as an unfortunate gap in pediatric psychiatric guidance. But what happened next in the Riley household turned that gap into something far more devastating. According to prosecutors, Carolyn Riley did not administer that medication according to any doctor's actual instructions. Instead, she began giving her 4-year-old daughter, Rebecca, doses that far exceeded anything that had ever been authorized. Not, prosecutors argued, to manage any genuine medical episode, but to keep her sedated, quiet, compliant. To use the very medication meant to help her as something closer to a chemical tool for managing the ordinary, exhausting chaos of raising 3 young children at once. In the days leading up to December 13th, 2006, the physical toll of that overmedication became something that should have been impossible to overlook. Rebecca developed a severe cough, a high fever, an extreme lethargy that went far beyond ordinary childhood illness. These were not subtle warning signs. They were the visible physical markers of a small body absorbing far more chemical strain than it could withstand, and the people around Rebecca noticed. School nurses raised concerns about her siblings. Relatives who saw Rebecca directly pleaded with Carolyn, alarmed that the little girl could barely lift her own head. Carolyn Riley did not seek medical attention for her daughter. Instead, in the face of mounting concern from nearly everyone around her, she continued administering the same medication in an effort to keep Rebecca asleep. On the morning of December 13th, 2006, Rebecca Riley was found on the floor of her parents' bedroom. She had not survived the night. A comprehensive toxicology report and autopsy would later reveal a concentration of clonidine in Rebecca's system high enough that it would have proven fatal even in a full-grown adult. Her lungs, examiners found, were completely engorged with fluid, a direct physiological signature of a body that had endured a prolonged and catastrophic chemical overdose. Carolyn Riley stood trial beginning in early 2010. Prosecutors built their case around the picture of a mother who had chosen the path of sedation over the difficult hands-on demands of raising 3 young children, medicating her daughter into silence rather than confronting her needs directly. The defense pushed back forcefully, attempting to place the overwhelming share of responsibility on the prescribing psychiatrist, portraying Carolyn as a mother who had simply, if perhaps too passively, followed the instructions of a medical professional she had every reason to trust. In February 2010, the jury returned a verdict that fell between the two extremes the case had presented. They found Carolyn Riley guilty of second-degree murder, a finding that she had acted with reckless disregard for her daughter's life, even if the fully premeditated intent required for a first-degree conviction hadn't been established. Carolyn Riley was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years and was sent to the Massachusetts Correctional Institution at Framingham. Her husband, Michael Riley, was separately tried and convicted of first-degree murder for his own role in what happened to Rebecca. After serving roughly a decade behind bars, Carolyn Riley was granted parole and released in 2015, a release that reignited a national conversation about psychiatric medication in young children that in many ways is still ongoing today. Rebecca Riley's case remains one of the most cited examples in discussions about pediatric mental health diagnoses and medication oversight. A reminder of how important it is for caregivers and medical providers to work in close, careful coordination when a child's treatment involves medication of any kind. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 5. Julie Corey, July 23, 2009, Worcester Superior Court. There are crimes that shock because of their brutality, and then there are crimes that shock because of the sheer, almost incomprehensible architecture of deception it took to carry them out. Cases so specific, so far outside the normal catalogue of human behavior, that people hearing them for the first time often assume they must be exaggerated. This case is not an exaggeration. It happened on a summer afternoon in Worcester, Massachusetts, in 2009, and it ended with a young woman dead inside her own home and a newborn child taken from a womb that had already stopped beating. For months leading into that summer, 35-year-old Julie Corey had been quietly constructing one of the most elaborate personal fictions imaginable. She told everyone in her life, her boyfriend, her family, her neighbors, casual acquaintances, that she was pregnant. She spoke about due dates and doctor's visits. She talked about nursery colors and baby names, about the particular exhaustion that settles into a woman's body in the final stretch of pregnancy. She performed it convincingly enough that no one around her ever thought to question it. Friends offered congratulations. Family members began preparing for the baby's arrival, and as the weeks passed and her invented due date drew closer, Corey found herself boxed inside a lie that had grown too large, too socially entangled, to simply walk back. A fiction like that doesn't quietly fade. It demands an ending. It demands a baby. So Corey went looking for one. Her attention settled on 23-year-old Darlene Haynes, an acquaintance living nearby who was, unlike Corey, genuinely, joyfully 8 months pregnant. Haynes had no reason at all to suspect she had become the focus of anything. To her, Corey was simply someone she knew well enough to let inside her apartment. On July 23, 2009, Corey did exactly that, arriving at Haynes's Worcester apartment wearing the same warmth and familiarity she had presented to everyone in her life for months. But once the door closed behind her, prosecutors say that mask fell away entirely. Corey turned on Haynes with sudden severe violence, striking her repeatedly until she could no longer defend herself, and then using an electrical cord to cut off her ability to breathe entirely. Darlene Haynes, 8 months into carrying a child she would never get to meet, did not survive what happened to her that afternoon, in the one place she should have been safest. What happened next is the part of this case that is almost impossible to fully absorb. As Haynes lay on the floor, Corey retrieved a small, sharp knife, and with no medical training, no sterile instruments, and no anesthesia, she opened Haynes's abdomen in a crude, improvised procedure. Working entirely alone, in circumstances too grim to easily picture, Corey lifted a living 8-month-old baby girl from the body of the woman she had just attacked. The infant was crying. She had survived the very event that took her mother's life. Corey wrapped the newborn in blankets, did what she could to clean the scene, and left Darlene Haynes concealed inside a closet, hidden from anyone who might come looking. She then walked out of that apartment, cradling a stolen child, as though she had simply given birth herself. For the next 48 hours, Corey lived out the final act of her fiction with unsettling ease, presenting the baby girl to her boyfriend, an extended family, with a story about a sudden, unexpected labor and a quiet delivery at a local clinic. No one doubted her. Why would they? She had been expecting for months. The timeline lined up perfectly because she had spent months making sure it would. The fiction held for exactly as long as Darlene Haynes's body stayed hidden, and not a moment longer. It was Haynes's landlord who eventually noticed an unmistakable odor drifting from the apartment and went to investigate. What he found ended everything. Police descended on the scene, and a frantic search began. As investigators pieced together Haynes's final days, word began to circulate about Corey's suspicious, medically unverifiable birth. One with no hospital record, no clinic visit, no doctor who could confirm any of it had happened. The threads connected quickly. Investigators eventually located Corey at a homeless shelter in Plymouth, New Hampshire, where she had fled with her boyfriend and the infant, apparently believing that distance alone could keep the truth from catching up to her. DNA testing erased any remaining doubt. The infant belonged to Darlene Haynes, and in a small mercy amid an otherwise devastating case, the baby had survived her violent, chaotic entry into the world completely unharmed. Corey was extradited back to Massachusetts to stand trial. Her defense mounted an insanity argument, claiming she suffered from deep, consuming delusions surrounding pregnancy and motherhood, delusions severe enough, they argued, that she could not understand the wrongfulness of her actions. Prosecutors dismantled that argument piece by piece, presenting evidence of extensive, deliberate planning. Internet searches conducted in the days beforehand, a mapped escape route already prepared, choices made with clarity, not delusion. In February 2014, following a trial that forced jurors to confront details most people would spend a lifetime trying to avoid, Julie Corey was convicted of first-degree murder committed with extreme atrocity and cruelty. She received a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole and is currently serving that sentence at the Massachusetts Correctional Institution at Framingham, a case that permanently altered how one community understood the outer edge of what a human being is capable of. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 6. Kristen Longley, November 27, 2015. Hampton Superior Court obsession, left alone in isolation long enough, has a way of curdling into something far more dangerous than heartbreak. And Kristen Longley's story is, at its core, a story about what happens when someone cannot let go of an ending that has already definitively arrived. Longley was 31 years old, living in West Springfield, Massachusetts, and had spent years entangled in a volatile on-again, off-again relationship with a man named David Cullison, a relationship that had produced a young daughter, and alongside her, years of emotional wreckage that neither of them had ever fully recovered from. By the summer of 2015, that chapter had finally conclusively closed. Cullison moved forward with his life. He began seeing 30-year-old Jennifer Best, a woman who had no history at all in this fractured family, no responsibility whatsoever for its collapse. She was simply someone stepping, innocently, into a new relationship with a man whose past had not finished with him yet. For Longley, that ending refused to stay closed. Something in her fractured under its weight, a mixture of depression and rage with nowhere productive to go, grief slowly calcifying into obsession. She could not reconcile herself to a future that no longer had Cullison at its center, And in the weeks that followed, the tension between her and Jennifer Best escalated from cold distance into open hostility, threatening phone calls, venomous late-night text exchanges, the kind of slow-building storm that in hindsight looked far more dangerous than ordinary post-breakup bitterness. 2 days before the tragedy, Longley put her intentions into writing, composing a note addressed directly to Cullison that left little ambiguity about what was coming. In her own words, plain, resigned, unsettling in their calm, she wrote that she had always loved him, that she was sorry for what she was about to do, but that she now understood he was truly gone for good, and that if Jennifer Best had taken her life away from her, she would take Best's life in return. Around this same period, a forensic review of Longley's phone would later reveal she had been quietly researching untraceable poisons online, a detail that painted a picture not of a single moment of uncontrollable fury, but of cold, deliberate planning stretching back days before anything happened. On the night of Friday, November 27th, 2015, after finishing a shift at a local Dunkin' Donuts, Longley armed herself with a knife she habitually carried and drove directly to a home on Chester Street in West Springfield, where Cullison was staying temporarily with his uncle. She hadn't come to talk. She confronted Jennifer Best directly, presenting old text messages as supposed proof that she and Cullison had secretly reconnected behind Best's back. The confrontation ignited almost instantly. A violent physical struggle broke out in the kitchen and spilled into an adjacent bedroom. Two women grappling in tight quarters as the entire situation spun beyond anyone's control. In the middle of that chaos, Longley struck Jennifer Best with the knife, severing major blood vessels in a single catastrophic motion. As Cullison desperately tried to wrench the weapon from Longley's hand, witnesses inside the home heard her repeat, almost like a line she had rehearsed, the same haunting words from her note days earlier, that Best had taken her life, and now she was taking Best's in return. Jennifer Best was rushed to Bay State Medical Center, but her injuries were beyond what doctors could reverse. She was pronounced dead shortly after arrival, a life ended not over years of history, but over a matter of weeks in the wake of someone else's unraveling. Longley was arrested at the scene and held without bail. In her earlier statements to detectives, she claimed she had blacked out during the struggle, insisting she had no clear memory of the fatal moment. She also alleged, without any corroboration, that Best had previously threatened her young daughter, an apparent attempt to reframe a planned act as a desperate protective one. But the case against her was overwhelming from every direction. Physical evidence recovered at the scene, eyewitness accounts from Cullison's own family who watched the struggle unfold, and, most damning of all, her own handwritten note, composed 2 full days before she ever picked up the knife. Faced with evidence this conclusive, Longley made the calculated decision to bypass a lengthy jury trial altogether. On April 3, 2017, inside Hampton Superior Court, she pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. At her sentencing hearing, she broke down in tears, delivering an apology to Jennifer Best's grieving family and publicly acknowledging long, untreated struggles with substance abuse and psychiatric illness, an admission that arrived, for the family listening, years too late. The judge sentenced Kristen Longley to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after serving a mandatory minimum of 15 years. She was sent to the Massachusetts Correctional Institution at Framingham, where she remains today, living out, year after year, the exact consequence she had promised in writing 2 days before she made it real. If you or someone you know is dealing with an escalating pattern of obsessive or threatening behavior following a relationship's end, please don't wait to reach out for help. A local domestic violence resource or mental health professional can make a real difference before a situation like this one has the chance to unfold. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 7. Elba Morales, December 20th, 2016, Suffolk Superior Court. Some killings don't come from months of careful planning. They come from years of accumulated friction, finally striking a spark that nobody in the room can contain. That is the story that unfolded inside a cramped multi-family apartment building on Fayston Street in Dorchester in the frozen early hours of December 20th, 2016. Elba Morales was 47 years old and had lived at that Fayston Street address for years, sharing the building's tight quarters and thin walls with a rotating cast of neighbors, among them 34-year-old Sasha Morris. The relationship between the two women had never been an easy one. Small grievances, the kind that fester in close proximity living, had built up over time into something harder and more brittle. Not quite hostility outright, but something adjacent to it, a resentment that simmered just beneath the surface of every hallway greeting and shared laundry room encounter. On the night of December 19th, that simmering tension found its accelerant. Both women happened to be inside the same apartment that evening, the home of Morris's boyfriend, located within the same building, and alcohol flowed freely as old grievances resurfaced in conversation. What began as tense small talk curdled, as the night wore on, into something sharper and more personal. By the time the clock rolled past midnight into the early hours of December 20th, the atmosphere inside that apartment had become combustible. Inside the kitchen, the argument between Morales and Morris finally broke into the open. Voices raised, old wounds reopened, years of unspoken resentment suddenly given full voice. Words gave way to something physical, the two women trading blows in a chaotic, ugly scuffle. A witness inside the apartment stepped in and managed to physically pull the two women apart, believing, as anyone reasonably would, that the danger had passed once the fists stopped flying. It hadn't. Instead of retreating, instead of using the intervention as a chance to cool down, Morales's fury only intensified. She moved to the kitchen counter, picked up a large knife, and lunged directly past the witness who had just worked to separate them. In a matter of seconds, she struck Sasha Morris twice, driving the blade home with a finality that transformed a drunken apartment argument into something the building's residents would never forget. Morris collapsed to the kitchen floor as the apartment erupted into panic. Morales did not stay to help. She fled the scene entirely, sprinting up 2 flights of stairs to a neighbor's unit on the 3rd floor, where she managed to get her hands on the keys to that neighbor's red sedan, a desperate, almost frantic bid to disappear into the night. Downstairs, Morris's boyfriend was already on the phone with emergency services, his voice cracking as he tried to explain what had just happened in his own kitchen. Boston police officers arrived at Fayston Street at approximately 12:50 in the morning, moving quickly through a scene still thick with chaos and fear. They found Morales exactly where her escape attempt had stalled, sitting inside the red sedan, frantically working the ignition and gear shift, trying to force the car into drive before officers could reach her. She never made it out of the parking spot. Officers drew their weapons, ordered her out of the vehicle, and placed her in handcuffs. As they did, Morales offered a chillingly casual remark that would later underscore just how unbothered she seemed by the violence that had just occurred. "I know, I've been to jail before." Downstairs, paramedics fought to save Sasha Morris's life, performing emergency treatment at the scene before rushing her to Boston Medical Center. It wasn't enough. She was pronounced dead shortly after arrival, one more life lost to a fight that had already been broken up once before it turned fatal. Morales was indicted by a Suffolk County grand jury, and her defense team built their case around the idea of a woman who had been pushed into a corner rather than one who had gone looking for violence. They pointed to a severe bruise on Morales's own face, sustained during the initial physical altercation, arguing that Morris had been the primary aggressor and that what followed was a frantic, unplanned reaction born out of a physical confrontation already in motion. Prosecutors saw it differently and argued it more simply. The fight had already been stopped. The two women had already been separated. Morales made an independent choice in that pause, to arm herself and go finish what the witness had just worked to end. In December 2018, following a multi-day trial in Suffolk Superior Court, the jury sided with the prosecution's narrative and convicted Elba Morales of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison with the statutory possibility of parole after 15 years and transferred into the custody of the Massachusetts Correctional Institution at Framingham. A decades-long sentence born from a conflict that had already once been stopped in time. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 8. Roxanne Doucette, December 1st, 2023. Aya District Court. There is a particular kind of modern tragedy that could not have existed a generation ago, one born entirely of the internet's ability to manufacture intimacy out of thin air, to let a stranger become a soulmate through nothing but a screen and a carefully written script. The case of Roxanne Doucette stands as one of the strangest and most unsettling examples of exactly that phenomenon, colliding with a real marriage and a real family. Doucette was 64 years old, living in the small town of Townsend, Massachusetts, and had spent 45 years married to her husband Paul Doucette, then 73. By any conventional measure, hers had been a life built on decades of stability. A long marriage, a background running a licensed home daycare, the kind of quiet, small-town existence that draws little attention from the outside world. But somewhere along the way, that stability cracked, and Roxanne fell, with startling completeness, into an online romance scam. The person behind the scheme had chosen his disguise carefully, a fabricated profile impersonating a recognizable daytime soap opera actor. Over the following months, this fictional persona showered Doucette with exactly the kind of romantic attention and validation that made the fantasy impossible to walk away from, while quietly, steadily, drawing significant sums of money from her in the background, the real engine driving the entire scheme. By her own later account, she ended up sending roughly $4,000 to the person she believed was a genuine celebrity admirer, someone she had always wanted to meet, as she would later tell investigators. By late 2023, the manipulation reached its most dangerous phase. On December 1st, the person behind the scam, still posing as the actor, sent Doucette a message with a demand that crossed from romantic fantasy into something far darker. She needed to remove her husband from her life. He needed her, the message insisted, too much to keep sharing her with anyone else. Doucette's response wasn't immediate refusal. She told the scammer she needed to think about it. Later that same afternoon, she sent a message back that would later become the centerpiece of the entire case against her, describing an amazing soup she was preparing, one containing a special potion, and specifying there would be just enough for him. Not long after, she followed up again, musing about her husband not feeling well, and almost casually about the possibility of collecting on his life insurance. Just after 5 o'clock that same day, Doucette called emergency services herself, reporting that Paul was completely unresponsive. He was rushed to Nashoba Valley Medical Center in critical condition, barely conscious. While hospital staff worked to stabilize him, the couple's adult daughter grew increasingly suspicious of her mother's behavior. Something about Roxanne's demeanor didn't sit right. Going through her mother's phone to gather evidence of the ongoing romance scam, the daughter instead found the trail of messages about the soup, the special potion, and the mention of life insurance, and immediately alerted police. When officers arrived to seize Doucette's phone and tablet as evidence, she refused to hand them over, and when 2 officers moved to take her into custody, she resisted physically. It took both officers to finally get her into handcuffs. Here is where the case took its first significant turn. A hospital toxicology screening on Paul Doucette came back negative, though the daughter would later point out to police that the test appeared to have only screened for a narrow range of substances, not the broader panel that might have explained her father's collapse. That ambiguity, a husband who survived, a test that found nothing conclusive, and a wife who insisted from the doorway of her own home that the soup was simply old and that she would never try to harm anyone, would come to define how this case was ultimately resolved. Doucette was arrested and charged with attempted murder, witness intimidation, resisting arrest and assault and battery on a police officer. At her arraignment in Aya District Court, she was released on personal recognizance under strict conditions, a GPS ankle monitor, home confinement, a mandated mental health evaluation, and a no-contact order barring any communication with either her husband or daughter. Publicly, she remained defiant and tearful in equal measure, telling reporters she loved her husband very, very much, and that the entire situation was one big misunderstanding. That no-contact order became the final complication in her case. After her arrest, Doucette reached out to her husband despite the standing protective order, a violation that would ultimately become the only charge to stick. Facing a case built heavily on suggestive text messages but weakened by a negative toxicology screen and the inherent difficulty of proving intent beyond a reasonable doubt, prosecutors and Doucette's defense reached a resolution. She pleaded guilty to violating the abuse protection order, and in exchange, the far more serious charges, attempted murder, witness intimidation, resisting arrest and assault and battery on a police officer, were dismissed entirely. A judge sentenced Roxanne Doucette to 1 year of probation. She was not sentenced to any correctional facility and served no time behind bars, a resolution that left the central question of her case formally unanswered by any court, whether a special potion soup was an act of attempted harm or the delusion of a scam victim spiraling out of control. If you believe someone you love may be the target of a romance scam, resources through the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center can help you report it and get guidance before a situation escalates. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 9. Michelle Carter, July 13, 2014. Bristol Juvenile Court. Some cases don't end in a struggle, a weapon, or a chase through the night. Some cases end in silence, in the quiet glow of a phone screen, in the space between 2 words typed and sent. The case of Commonwealth versus Michelle Carter became exactly that kind of case, and in doing so, it forced American courts to confront a question they had never really had to answer before. Can words alone, sent from miles away, carry legal responsibility for the end of someone else's life? Conrad Roy III was 18 years old, carrying the quiet, invisible weight of severe clinical depression, along with a history of crisis that had already alarmed the people who loved him. Into that fragile inner world came Michelle Carter, 17, a girl living in a separate Massachusetts town who had never, in 2 full years of relationship, actually spent much time with Roy in person. Theirs was a relationship built almost entirely out of the ether. Thousands upon thousands of text messages, emails and phone calls, an entire emotional universe constructed without the grounding of physical presence, without the friction of face-to-face reality to check it. For a long stretch of that relationship, Carter played a role that looked, on the surface, almost supportive, encouraging Roy toward professional mental health treatment, urging him to get help. But in the weeks leading into July 2014, something in her shifted dramatically and irreversibly. The encouragement toward getting help reversed itself entirely into something far darker. Carter began validating his darkest thinking rather than challenging it. She helped him plan a specific method involving a gas-powered water pump inside his own truck, a device that, run in an enclosed space, would fill the cab with an invisible, dangerous gas. On the evening of July 12, 2014, Conrad Roy drove his pickup truck to a secluded Kmart parking lot in Fairhaven, Massachusetts. He turned on the generator, and the cab began to fill with fumes, and then, as his body's instincts overrode whatever had brought him there, he panicked. He opened the door. He stepped back out into the night air and reached for his phone to reach the one person he had shared all of this with. What happened next became the single most consequential exchange in the entire case. Roy told Carter he was scared, that he had gotten out of the truck, and Carter, from miles away, sent back 2 words that would follow her for the rest of her life. Get back in. He did. He climbed back into the truck he had just fled and did not survive the night. His body was discovered the next morning. When investigators later went through his phone, they found a staggering archive of messages between him and Carter, a record of a relationship that had curdled in its final weeks into something closer to a countdown. Perhaps most damning of all were messages Carter sent to her own friends afterward, in which she openly described her role in his final moments, how she'd had the chance to stop him, how she'd heard him get scared and step out of the truck, and how she had told him to get back in anyway. In 2015, Carter was charged with involuntary manslaughter, a charge that hinged on a legal theory without much American precedent, that speech alone, sent through a phone from someone never physically present, could constitute the kind of reckless conduct the law holds responsible for another person's death. Prosecutors argued that Carter's relentless psychological pressure, culminating in that final direct command, had effectively overridden Roy's own wavering will at the exact moment he was trying to save himself. The defense pushed back hard, arguing that Roy alone had built the circumstances that led to his death, that Carter's words were protected speech, and that Carter herself was a minor struggling with her own mental illness, her judgment potentially affected by prescription medication at the time. Carter waived her right to a jury trial, placing the entire weight of her case into the hands of a single judge. In June 2017, that judge found her guilty of involuntary manslaughter, ruling explicitly that her command to get back in the truck constituted conduct sufficient to bear legal responsibility for Roy's death. In August 2017, she was sentenced to 15 months in prison, a sentence her legal team fought all the way through a failed appeals process that ultimately reached the United States Supreme Court, which declined to intervene. Carter began serving her sentence in February 2019 at the Bristol County House of Correction in Dartmouth, Massachusetts. Citing good behavior, she was granted early release in January 2020, a case that permanently reshaped how the law thinks about the line between words and actions, and how far responsibility can extend when someone in crisis is reaching out for connection instead of help. If you or someone you know is struggling with thoughts of suicide, please know that support is available right now. The 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline can be reached free 24 hours a day by call or text. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 10. Erica Murray, August 28, 2014. Date of discovery, Worcester Superior Court. Some houses hide their secrets behind locked doors. The house on the outskirts of Blackstone, Massachusetts, hid hers behind something far more effective. Years of accumulated neglect so total, so overwhelming, that no one who saw it from the outside could have possibly imagined what lay just beyond its walls. To the neighbors of Blackstone, Erica Murray was simply an eccentric, reclusive mother, a woman raising 2 school-aged children, rarely seen, rarely heard from, living a quiet and unremarkable life alongside her boyfriend, Raymond Rivera. It was the kind of impression that invites no scrutiny, the kind of quiet a community simply absorbs without question. But inside that house, behind windows that hadn't been opened in longer than anyone could say, Murray had been living a double reality that defied comprehension. One in which she had secretly given birth to 3 additional children, hiding every pregnancy and every birth not just from her neighbors and extended family, but from her own boyfriend, the father figure to the children he knew about. The truth came out on August 28, 2014, when a neighbor's child, drawn by the sound of a crying baby, wandered into the Murray residence to investigate. What that child encountered inside triggered an immediate call to emergency services, and what responding investigators found, once they arrived in hazmat suits necessary simply to enter the structure, went beyond almost every boundary of what Child Protective Services and law enforcement had previously encountered. The interior of the home was buried floor to ceiling in waste and infestation so severe that the house itself would later be condemned and demolished by the town. Somewhere within that decay, investigators found 2 living children Murray had kept entirely hidden from the outside world, a 3-year-old girl and a 6-month-old infant, both left essentially unmonitored inside the home for their entire lives. Neither child could speak. Both showed profound developmental delays, the direct physiological result of total isolation stretching back to their very first days of life. But the discovery was not yet complete. A subsequent, more thorough search of the property uncovered something even more devastating, hidden deep within the closets of the home's bedrooms. The remains of 3 infants who had never made it into any hospital record, any birth certificate, any acknowledgement beyond the walls that had quietly hidden them. Murray was arrested and charged with an extensive list of offences, including counts of second-degree murder tied to the 3 infants, alongside multiple counts of criminal child neglect and cruelty relating to the conditions the surviving children and household animals had been forced to endure. Her case moved toward a high-profile bench trial in 2019, where her defense attorneys argued that Murray suffered from severe, long unaddressed mental illness and cognitive deficits, conditions, they claimed, that had genuinely paralyzed her ability to function, to clean, or to seek help. They also raised a critical forensic gap. Pathologists examining the 3 infants found in the closets could not conclusively determine whether any of them had been born alive, leaving open the grim possibility that some or all had been stillborn. That evidentiary gap proved decisive. Without clear medical proof that the infants had been born alive, the judge acquitted Murray of the murder charges entirely. She was, however, found guilty of felony child assault and battery, along with multiple counts of cruelty tied directly to the conditions the 2 surviving children had been forced to live in for years. Murray was sentenced to several years in prison and sent to the Massachusetts Correctional Institution at Framingham. After receiving credit for the substantial time she had already spent in custody awaiting trial, she completed the remainder of her sentence and was released back into the community under strict post-release probation conditions, leaving behind a case that remains, for the investigators and neighbors who lived through it, one of the most disturbing discoveries in the state's history. If this case raises any concern about a child's safety in your own community, please don't hesitate to reach out. The Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline is available around the clock to take reports and offer guidance. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. 10 cases, 10 women, 10 10 moments where an ordinary life in an ordinary Massachusetts town turned into something that would end up in a courtroom, a headline, and eventually a story like the one we've just told you. It would be easy to walk away from a documentary like this one, thinking about only the darkness in it. The poisoned drink, the over-medicated child, the improvised knife, the phone screen glowing in the dark. And that darkness is real. It deserves to be looked at honestly without flinching, because pretending these things don't happen protects no one. But if you look closely at what actually connects these 8 cases, you'll notice something else, something quieter than the violence itself. Almost every one of these stories began somewhere ordinary. A long relationship that had simply gone on too long past its natural end. A mother trying to manage more than any one person reasonably could, alone with too little support and too much medication in the house. A woman who told one lie that grew larger than she could control. A person manipulated for months by someone who was never who they claimed to be. A relationship carried out almost entirely through a screen, where 2 people never learn to read each other the way real presence forces you to. A grudge between neighbors that had already once been calmed down before it wasn't. None of these women woke up one day as strangers to the people around them. That's what makes cases like these so difficult to sit with, and also, in a strange way, so important to understand. The line between an ordinary strained life and an irreversible act is often thinner than any of us would like to believe. Isolation, untreated mental illness, unresolved jealousy, unchecked manipulation, and unaddressed warning signs run through nearly every one of these stories like a single thread. Different in every case, but never entirely absent. That thread is also where the accountability in these stories ultimately lives. Courts in Essex, Suffolk, Worcester, Hampton, and Bristol counties each had to weigh the same difficult questions. What was planned and what wasn't? What was intended and what was reckless? What could be proven beyond a reasonable doubt and what remained, even after a trial genuinely uncertain? Some of these women are serving sentences that will keep them behind bars for the rest of their lives. Others served years and were released. One served only probation, in a case that a court itself was never able to fully resolve. The justice system doesn't always deliver the same outcome twice, even when the underlying human patterns look strikingly similar. And that too is part of what makes these cases worth understanding rather than simply reacting to. If there's a single thread we'd ask you to carry away from tonight's documentary, it's this. Warning signs are rarely invisible in hindsight. A school nurse noticing something wrong, a relative pleading with a mother to get help, a daughter going through a phone out of concern, a witness stepping physically between 2 people fighting. In almost every one of these cases, someone saw something before it became irreversible. Listening to those moments, really listening and acting on them, is, in the end, the only thing that stands between a strained relationship and a story like the ones we've told you here tonight. If any part of what you've heard tonight touched something closer to home than you expected, please don't carry it alone. The 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline, the National Domestic Violence Hotline, and the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline are all available right now, free and confidential, and reaching out is never an overreaction. Thank you for spending this time with us tonight. These stories are heavy, and we don't take lightly the responsibility of telling them. Every case in this documentary was told with the goal of understanding what happened and why, never to sensationalize the people whose lives were lost. If this documentary moved you, taught you something, or left you thinking, that's exactly what we set out to do. And if you're new here, we'd genuinely love to have you stick around. Cold Case Hour is built on stories just like these. Cases that ask hard questions about how ordinary lives end up somewhere no one saw coming. Before you go, hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next one. Drop a comment and let us know which of tonight's cases stayed with you the most. And if you found value in this documentary, a like genuinely helps us keep bringing you cases like this one. We'll see you in the next episode.